Welcome to Off the Wire, the podcast that helps you curb your cybersecurity risk and tackle technology challenges. I'm Tanner and I'm joined by Anthony. We're two IT executives with 35 years of experience. Let's start the show. Welcome back to another episode of Off the Wire with Tanner and Anthony. Today we're tackling operational technology systems and how we protect them and some tips and tricks there. But before we jump in, I just want to ask you to please subscribe to our show if you're enjoying it, whatever podcast platform you're on. If you're on YouTube, click the bell. That'll make sure you never miss any of our new episodes and uploads. And if you find value in our discussion, please share it with a colleague or friend and help the show grow. So, Anthony, we were kind of talking a little bit pre-show. We both have operational technology systems and networks in our environment. But I mean, for those that may not know, and I think a lot of our listeners are already going to know, what is an operational technology?
It's basically hardware and software that controls physical systems, and in our industry, it's commonly referred to as SCADA. That's where it basically controls the grid, either distribution or more commonly the transmission. But basically, it's just stuff that's actually doing physical controls of equipment in a nutshell. And you'll see it at manufacturing plants. Like I said, we're electric utility, so you'll see it at power plants, and you also see it at water plants as well. Really, any type of manufacturing, they typically have that as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that there's a lot of these networks that are kind of creeping into basically every business. I mean, if you look at like an HVAC network or lighting, I know we have both of those at work and they're all the time, they're controlled now. It's not just flipping the switch on. But obviously, the utility industry, there's a huge proponent of ICS or operational technology systems. ICS, I just use that. I probably should define it as industrial control systems. And those really operational technology and ICS can kind of be interchanged. So, why now, Anthony? Why now are we trying to look toward our OT networks and try to protect them? I mean, we've had them for a long time. Is it just like we decided to finally put something in the budget?
So those of us that have been in OT security or having to deal with it, I think the thing that kinda rang the bell for it to begin was Stuxnet, and that's where the Iranian nuclear program was hacked, and it was a closed system, and it's a really interesting story. There's lots of good reports out there, but in a nutshell, there were several zero-day exploits that were basically brought over by USB drive. Anyways, that was the one that hit the national news and made everyone aware that, hey, people are after your OT environments. I'm sure there were other incidents, but that was really the first time I had ever heard of a OT network being hacked. And the OT equipment, it's just so inherently insecure. A lot of it's where it's just in place. If you got IT stuff, basically IT equipment, you might have it between 5 and 7 years in your IT network. The stuff that's in the OT environment, it's in there for much longer. And, we like to patch everything, but in the OT environment, sometimes it's not capable of being patched. It could break something, and if you're dealing with electric or water or just whatever kind of manufacturing, it's not always possible to do that. So, anyways, there's been a big push to try to secure these networks because they're just so inherently insecure, and you just have to do it in different ways and different tactics.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's really a different mindset with OT networks, right? It's not, I think on the IT side of things, we often talk features and capabilities. On the OT network, it's reliability. That is king. It has to work. Sometimes, in many cases, it's a life safety issue where if this thing doesn't work, someone could be killed. So, patching things, staying up to date, having the latest in security protocols and things like that, that's not necessarily in the front end of how they design these systems. I guess we prioritized IT networks. I think maybe it's just we thought, hey, these are computers that are on the internet and they're more likely to have a compromise. So let's work on them first. But I know we have definitely prioritized IT and then, kind of looked, inwardly, I guess, into OT as we've gone along.
Yeah, it's definitely the same case for me. So I've been at Fort County for 6 years, and I would say probably spent the first 4 years just working on the IT network security. And we knew we had a lot to do on the OT network, and we're going to talk about this, but just segmenting your IT from your OT network, we just accomplished that last year. And so for those that don't have that, you definitely want to look into that, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah, we both reviewed a video, a really great video. We might actually want to link it, but it was given by one of the upper level guys at Drago's, actually maybe the founder, and he brought up a really good point that I hadn't thought about, and that is that OT systems used to be really heterogeneous. So if you had like an HVAC system, it ran a custom OS, it ran custom controls, custom protocols, custom commands. Now, just in like in the IT world, we kind of standardize, right? If you think about it, there's not 47 different web server platforms out there. There's a few large ones. Typically, there's Windows One, there's several on Linux, but they tend to be the ones that get used over and over, right? You think of like Apache and Log4j and the issue there. That wasn't that way in the OT world. Now we are starting to see that. We are starting to see the OS level being shared between different OT products. And they're starting to use similar web servers, right? For the same reasons we did. But because of that, now, the old things, you mentioned Stuxnet, right? It was like pinpoint thing to do one thing, right? And nowadays, you can build something that affects a bunch of different OT systems, at once without having to program something specific for just one. So, we were taking a look at this video, and Anthony, I don't know, it stuck out to me. Did it stick out to you kind of the reasons, like the commonality, I guess, between the OT attacks they had seen and like what the people did wrong?
I was really surprised from the findings of this report. The first one is 28% were caused by misconfigured firewalls protecting the OT environment. There's always a huge focus on the perimeter, especially with the OT. And I was really surprised that was a cause. 28% is quite a bit. Another item is 28% is lack of network segmentation, whether that's physical or logical, not having that network segmentation. And that's something, like I said, we just dealt with this last year at the beginning of 2024. So, if you haven't segmented your network, make sure you're doing that now, make it a priority. And that's one of the, for those that are in the co op industry, it's one of the NRECA cyber goals. And it's in there for a reason. It's pretty important. And then this one really caught me off guard was 1 in 10 share authentications between the IT network and the OT network. Did that surprise you, Tanner?
Yeah, definitely. I can see it though, because you think, well, okay, what I got to maintain a whole separate environment. People got to use the same, I'm sure it was a convenience decision, but yeah, that was pretty surprising. And I just wanted to mention, and we probably need a whole video on this, I guess, but the network segmentation, I've heard a lot of people, just putting your things in different networks is not adequate network segmentation. A lot of people kind of just say, well, these two networks are apart and that's it. And they don't really go through that strenuous process of really the zero trust mindset of actually locking things down to just what is required and limiting things and kind of going with a whitelist mentality versus a blacklist mentality and just allowing a small amount of things, blocking everything else. But I see that a lot of people kind of say they're segmented, and then when you actually get in there, you kind of see, well, there's some holes in your plan, right? But it just, I guess in the cybersecurity world, it's just really good to not speak in absolutes. Maybe that's the best way to say it.
Yeah, I think you're always gonna find some co-mingling, but I think the important part is that you know what they are and they're identified. If you don't know where you've got integration into your IT network, you need to have that. Another thing I'll mention, I'll just reference the Purdue model, and this was something when we were redoing our network. There was some talk about doing ACLs on the layer 3 switches that we have, and I was like, "Nope, it's gotta go through a stateful packet inspection between each layer," which means it's gotta go through a firewall. So it's definitely all those different segments, even with your OT environment, have to be segmented by our firewall. So that's very important. Like I said, the devil's in the details. The last stat that they had, 20% of OT assets communicating with external addresses. That one is a real surprise. I would recommend, even if you have your own vulnerability and penetration testing tools, that you reach out. There's CISA, and we'll list some in the show notes, but there's several organizations out there that'll do a free vulnerability scanner. It never hurts to have a second pair of eyes. So, we do vulnerability scans, but we also have a third party doing that, and we're getting it done for free. So there's several organizations out there that'll do it for free.
Yeah, definitely. And I will say, if you're going to actually do like a full on, a pen test or snooping around your OT environment, highly recommend finding someone who's extremely capable in that regard, just because, obviously you can impact a lot of things, right? These are important systems. Or, one thing we've thought about doing and have not done it yet is basically building kind of a test environment that's a direct copy of one of our ICS systems, and then basically having the pen test on that to kind of see what, honestly, uh, part of a pen test, I don't know. We've been through several at this point now, but part of a pen test to me is not necessarily only what we need to fix, but also what we can, what are we actually seeing? Like, do we actually notice the different things that they're doing? So I thought in the video they did a really good job kind of breaking things down. I think, and we've talked about different frameworks, Anthony, like the CIS framework. And I think a lot of times people jump into those, and even myself, I mean, we're kind of going through a framework change. We're moving from one to another, and you get into it, and it kind of gets overwhelming really quick because it just seems like there's so many controls, right? And you're like, where do I focus? I thought they did a really good job talking about like really five critical controls, and I think this is actually published in SANS. And basically, there's five like kind of critical controls that we need to do to protect our OT environments. And then, we're going to kind of talk through those a little bit, and then we're actually going to talk about some of the practical tips, kind of like things you can check this week, right? And that's part of what we want to do in the podcast is provide you guys with something that you can kind of take action on. So there's five controls. Having an ICS incident response plan. So you need to have something more than just your normal IRP for your IT network. A defensible architecture, and this goes back to what you just mentioned, Anthony, with the having a firewall in place, right? Having something that you can actually defend. Having a network monitoring visibility at the very least inside your ICS environment. Securing your remote access, which you just talked about that, and those links from IT to OT. And then risk-based vulnerability management. Anthony, were there any of those that, like, I guess you didn't expect to be on there? Were there any that you were like, oh yeah, that's 100% like the most important thing? I mean, what did you think about those lists? I like that they brought it down into five.
I don't know that I was necessarily surprised, but there's a few things that recently just come about for us. So, like the incident response plan, our VP of operations, Scott Cook, we've had discussions and tabletops, and he's mentioned, do we have enough people that could go out to the substations and, turn everything into bypass mode to where it has to be manually operated? That's the kind of stuff you need to have in your incident response plan and you need to be talking about as an organization. And then the network monitoring, I mentioned the vulnerability scan, that was meant for just the outside of your information technology network, just to see if you have any OT stuff popping up in there. Or you definitely don't want to run a vulnerability scanner on the inside of your OT network. You're going to wreak havoc. But with that, the just having some kind of monitoring solution, there is a ton of solutions out there. There's Dragos, there's Cisco Cybervision, there's Darktrace, Tenable OT. I'm sure there's many others. And one thing that just recently came up in the news is I believe it was Dragos. If your critical infrastructure and your revenues under a certain dollar amount, I believe it's 100 million, you can get free monitoring from them. I don't know the details of that, but I've seen that in the news and the headlines. The one thing I will say with the vulnerability management, there was some surprises in there. Basically, it was just saying that, out of all the vulnerabilities out there, most of them don't need to be remedied. You need to basically, mitigate it. So if you got a certain finding, can you mitigate it by, blocking it on the network or, using MFA or couple with something else to address that?
Yeah, and I mean, I think we do that on the IT side of things, don't you think? Really, we look at our vulnerability and we sit there and we're like, okay, what's critical? What's high? We obviously work our way from there. We look at the ones, I'm sure you do this as well, looking at what's actually being exploited. Like, I remember one, and I can't remember exactly which one, but it's one maybe a year ago where we got one, and it's that ability to exploit it. Yeah, it was high, and we did patch it. I mean, we didn't like, oh, don't worry about this, but we did patch it. But when you looked at actually how it had to be done to actually gain, the access, it was very hard to do. It was really one of those where like they already had to have your network made anyway. And if you had your network made, and this was like going to be on the last of my list of things to worry about, but we did obviously patch it. But those are, we kind of do that, right? We look at the vulnerabilities that come out and we kind of do a risk assessment, kind of a quick and dirty risk assessment, which is this system needs to be shut down right now and patched. This one can wait till 9 p.m. This one needs to be done by the end of the week. This one is something that we need to double check to be sure it won't hurt anything, those kinds of things. But you got to do that, especially on the OT side, because these systems are critical, right? We're talking SCADA, we're talking the control of the power grid. You can't just be willy nilly. I wish we could. I hope we get to a point where we can, where we can just push updates just like we do on I. But it's going to be tough with just what's at stake. So let's talk through the practical tips we had, and I think we've kind of alluded to a few of them. But this first one I know is like really near and dear to your heart, right? It has to be stateful inspection. So monitoring both your north-south traffic. Obviously, we hope everyone's doing that in their OT environment, at least the egress and the ingress from the IT or other networks. But obviously monitoring east and west too. And like, what's your guys' strategy for that, Anthony? Like, how do you, and you may not have it completely done, but like, what's your goal? Like, where are you working toward on that?
So for the east to west, I mean, we do have it firewalled, and we could potentially get an alert from our firewall, but this is where having an actual specific OT monitoring tool will come into hand. And uh, this is something I'm really thankful for. We've got a grant, and we're going to be getting a OT monitoring tool. We work with our statewide organization, and we'll be having that. And so, like, for us, like, we've got like 32 substations, depending on how you count them. But, those substations, they need to talk to the server, and the server needs to talk to them. Well, the substations don't need to talk to each other. And that's that east and west traffic. If you see them trying to talk to each other, then, that's a sign that something's going wrong, or there's a malicious actor.
I agree with you wholeheartedly on that. I think a physical firewall in probably almost every case is better. It's just hard to manage in a lot of cases. So I know there are some software products now that can allow you to kind of have that scale and that cost, especially if, we're talking about small, medium businesses here. We're not talking about unlimited budgets. And I love Palo Alto, but they are not the cheapest option out there. Ensuring OT is not publicly accessible, you need to make sure that anything that talks out in your environment, really, honestly, it's IT or OT, but anything that's talking out is something that like you're expecting, right? You don't want just random things talking out the internet. If you do have maybe a security tool you just mentioned, maybe having that OT monitoring, obviously it's going to have to look out there to see what the latest and greatest as far as attack methods and methodologies and things like that are. But you don't want your random, substation speaking out to the internet. That's almost always, I would say, a bad sign. And you talked about some of the things you can do. There's a lot of organizations that'll check into those kinds of things for you. They'll do assessments. Even if you don't want to do that, you can easily do your own assessment. There are many good frameworks. And then you can also just look at the five ones we just mentioned earlier. We talked about network segmentation. I think, as mentioned, the firewalls, especially hardware firewalls, are scalable at the level that maybe is needed right now. It seems like the vendors that are in this arena, maybe they're thinking a little bit more about the bottom line than the protection. It doesn't seem like it right now, at least I know with Palo and some of the others, the cost, I know there are lower cost options, but it doesn't seem to be able to scale to what it needs to be for the cost. What do you think about that?
Yeah, for us, we're doing a lot of back and forth with our firewalls, just kind of routing the traffic back and forth, which is one inefficient. It was either that or, the like you mentioned, the Palo Altos, they're not cheap. Are we gonna roll out some, cheap like not there's anything wrong with PF Sense, but use like open source hardware, and that would be the only way we could afford to have a firewall like at each substation, is to do something relatively cheap. And I'd rather, even though it's inefficient, we've got a pretty good backbone for our network for speed, so we kind of just route everything back and forth to the Palo, but not ideal. But otherwise, I don't know how you could afford it. And then, people talk about network segmentation. I'm not going to preach one way or the other. There's either physically separating your network or logically. It depends on, if you're under NERC, depending on NERC guidance and what you do. If you're generating power, you may have to have like a whole separate physical environment and have physical separation. That's very costly to do so. We use logical separation. It's just to rebuild a whole nother network costs quite a bit of money, and it's hard enough to pay for all the equipment and replace switches as they become end of life now.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that's one of those things that's probably also maybe an older way of thinking. And we've talked about this a lot, just me and you, about how everything's integrating, and it's integrating not only in IT stuff. I mean, there's OT integration as well. I mean, these networks, they're powerful in what they do, but they're also powerful in the data that they provide. And we need that data. And usually in the other systems, maybe it's analytic systems, potentially AI, looking at this kind of data in the future. So I think there's just that convergence, right, where the OT stuff is getting really close to how the IT stuff operates. So I don't think it's a bad line of thinking. I think physically separating things is in most ways better. I don't think it's hard to make an argument against it other than cost.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes people get into this line of thinking where they think if they can't do it to the 100% like the best possible way, then they just shouldn't do it at all, right? If you're not gonna, be able to do it exactly how NERC says to do it, then let's just not worry with it. You got to make sure, to your point, if you can't afford physical hardware that's separate, then just do it logically. I mean, you're still going to have a very effective and secure system. You mentioned the next point, passive monitoring, talking about these tools that are OT specific. That's something I hope we have soon. But you guys are kind of putting that in right now, so that's exciting. What do these systems do? I guess like what are you expecting to get out of a system like this?
Really just monitoring, abnormal communications, that's a big one. But you can't do active vulnerability scans, you can't do active scanning on OT networks. All of these tools, basically are doing passive monitoring. They're sniffing the traffic and just kinda listening to see what's going on out there. So you could see, maybe you have vulnerabilities that's going across your network, or do you have people talking in telnet? Do we got stuff that's being logged in via telnet? Being able to identify those weaknesses, the abnormal communications, and stuff like that. That's really what we're looking to gain out of it.
Yeah, no, it's a great system and also kind of helps you with that inventory, which is a really big part of cybersecurity as well. You need to know what you have or you don't know what to protect, right? We obviously need to protect our endpoints. So that's the next tip there is practice good endpoint security. You need some sort of solution. I know a lot of times SCADA, maybe clients and computers, to your point, they don't get all the updates. Still need to have a tool that's hopefully going to give you some enhancement on notifying you and monitoring what's happening on the desktop, right? Because we do know a lot of attacks can come from that.
Yeah, this is one where we kinda differed from the normal suggestions, and we did put our EDR on the OT workstations and servers. Unfortunately, in doing so, they have to be able to communicate out to the internet. Now, we limited, the egress and ingress. We locked that down as tight as we can by IP or DNS entries and the protocol. That's something I would rather have that, that communications opened up, but at least I know what's going on those workstations and servers. If they see anything abnormal or I know what vulnerabilities are on there since I can't, do a active scan on that. So that's something I'm not recommending people do that, but that's something where we changed up when we redid our network.
Oh, you brought up a good point. You have to do a risk assessment on your own. Obviously, there are frameworks and there are standards, but I heard a good comment this week is the solutions need to, that we come up with need to be for our company, right? And every company is a little bit different, and I don't think you can put any one person or one company into a box. So you have to kind of make it work for you, your budget, your resources, your skill sets, all those kinds of things. You need to make sure you remove or eliminate shared services. You talked about this earlier. That was super surprising for you. It was surprising for me as well. So, especially identity. I mean, identity really needs to be separated. I don't think there's really almost any argument to not do that. But everything that you can, right? If you have, let's say, an OT database and an IT database, and they have like the same database server, that's something that you need to try to get rid of if possible. And other types of things too. If you think about it, an Active Directory environment obviously needs certificates. It needs DHCP servers. It needs DNS servers. It needs all those kinds of things. You need to make sure, best you can, that you're not sharing that because, to your point, if something happens, it can just flow right down into OT, and you don't want that. The last one is one that we are seeing becoming a lot more common on the IT side of things. Also, it is something that is becoming more common on the OT side of things is living on the land attacks. They're becoming much more common. So our tip is you need to shrink the size of your land, right? In the real world, nobody wants to take 50 acres and make it 5. But in the technology world, we want if we have services that are not absolutely required to do what we need to do, and this kind of goes back to zero trust a little bit too, and you need to just shrink that. And I know, Anthony, you were talking about in an earlier episode the CIS, the subscription, and I think you were saying they produce like some hardening guides for you to kind of make this a little bit easier.
Yeah, the CI's benchmarks, and this was outside of our desktops in IT, this was the second thing that we ran it against all of our servers and all of our workstations in the new OT environment that we stood up. So, yeah, that's just part of the whole zero trust mentality. All the default services, you need to turn off everything that you don't need. Just basically have the bare essentials you need to operate.
Yeah, absolutely. Anthony, final thoughts. What do you want to leave people with as they go and take these tips and take a look in their environments that have OT?
There's a lot of debate on ownership, and, a lot of times you've got engineering and you got OT, and you may have the engineering department say, "Well, I ain't got the time, I'm just trying to get this stuff running, and, I don't have the expertise to harden this," and then you may have the IT department, and they're like, "Well, that's engineering's responsibility." You gotta take ownership. It doesn't matter who, what department runs over it, the company's responsible. But you need to step up and do something, work together. Like, you have to work, if it's 2 different departments running your OT environment, you definitely need to work together on that. But I'm sure these days everyone wants to do the best thing and, secure that network.
Yeah, I will just add the only thing there is if you are working collaboratively, don't kind of dump something in someone's plate like all at once. We kind of to my point earlier about the frameworks, don't go over to the people that are helping you manage your OT environment and be like, here's the 27 things we need to change. Start with one thing, start with something small, work your way. I have a saying, and I'm sure I heard it somewhere. I'm sure it's not mine, but basically, if we're more secure today than we were yesterday, then we made progress. So just kind of break it off into chunks and help whoever's helping you manage that. If you're just kind of advising them, and sometimes we are in that role, right? We just are advising kind of application owners or system owners, or in this case, network owners. Just don't blow them up with a bunch of stuff. Help break it down into small chunks, something that they can actually take action on, and ultimately help you get a lot more secure. All right, that's another episode, Anthony. I enjoyed it. For our listeners out there, we appreciate you. If you have a great idea for another episode for us, shoot us an email, showitoffthewirepodcast.com, or you can reach out to us on any of our social media channels. We release our episodes every other Monday, and until next time, this is an episode of Off the Wire.